Are you a bicultural or immigrant family having a hard time getting your kids to speak your native tongue? Or do you and your family only speak English, but you're highly interested in giving your kids the gift of bilingualism? Regardless of your circumstances, it is possible to raise bilingual children. Today, I'm giving you 10 ways to make it happen. No more excuses. What's up, language leaders? Welcome back. My name is Erica, and today we are continuing our discussion about how to raise bilingual children. So in our last video, we debunked some myths on this topic. If you haven't seen that, you can check it out. I will link it below. But today we're talking about some specific things that you can do to make this happen. So as I mentioned in the last video, I'm a mommy of 2 bilingual girls, ages 7 and 2. We speak English and Spanish in our house, and I'm also learning French and attempting to teach that to them as well. Let's briefly touch on why this is so important for us to do. Now, if you have extended family or even immediate family who speak a different language than the main language of your household, then the reasons why it's important are kind of obvious. You know, if you want your kids to be able to have deep communication with their grandparents, for example. But for those of us who don't have that circumstance, it's important to remind ourselves of why bilingualism is such a beautiful gift that we can give our children. So the cognitive benefits of bilingualism are indisputable. Bilingual kids' brains have been linked with advanced skills in attention and executive function. Due to their ability to communicate with more people, they also often grow up with social advantages and have a highly desirable skill set for the business world. So let's get into the 10 methods, 10 tips that we can take to raise our children to be bilingual. So the first one on the list will apply to you if you're a 2-parent family and each of you speaks a different language. So our first method is the classic one person, one language, OPOL method. This is the main method that we used to raise our children bilingually. Now, this is just as it sounds. Each parent chooses which language they're going to speak to their children and tries to stick exclusively to that one. Now, often the language that each one chooses is their native language, as was the case with us, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Sometimes one of the parents has learned or is learning a language and they've learned it well enough so that they can communicate with their children in this language, even if it's not their native tongue. Now, the OPOL method generally creates more of a burden on one parent than the other one, just depending on which one of them is teaching the minority language, meaning the language that is least often spoken in the area where you live. Now, in the case of our family, my load is heavier to bear because we live in Mexico, so obviously English is definitely the minority language. We know a few expat families, but we don't spend large amounts of time with them, so I am pretty much the only English resource for my children. So this has been really challenging for me because since I've been around Spanish for so long, even with English being my native language, I don't have a preference one over the other. And I don't have one language which I tend to gravitate to more than the other. So what I tend to do is just respond in whatever language someone speaks to me in. So my children could have easily grown up only speaking Spanish because the oldest has been here in Mexico since she was 10 months old and my youngest was born here. So of course, since I'm a good mommy, I speak to my children in English 100% of the time. Okay, no, it's more like 80-20. I really do try to speak to them in English. And with my oldest, when this was the first time that I was going through this, I really made an effort to speak to her in English, but honestly, I would say that I spoke to her in Spanish 20% of the time, in English about 80% of the time, and most of the rest of her life was in Spanish. So you would think that she would speak more Spanish than English, but fortunately that has not been the case. In fact, now she just really prefers to speak to me in English. But when she was smaller, I would sometimes forget. And sometimes it wasn't that I would forget, but when there are other people around who only speak Spanish, such as her babysitter or really all of our friends, pretty much anyone, I don't want people to be left out of the conversation. Even if I am speaking with her, I just think it's more fun when everyone knows what everyone's saying. So I will naturally gravitate towards Spanish. Even so, she turned out perfectly bilingual. Now I'm on another mission with the youngest to do the same thing. Now, an advantage that she has is that she does have an older sister now who speaks English, and so I try to remind her to only speak to the youngest in English, and my older daughter will also do the same thing with me. If I'm speaking to the younger one in Spanish, she'll remind me, Mom, talk to her in English. So we kind of all help each other try to remember, but there is effort, there is thought that goes into it sometimes. So I do want you to understand that just because maybe your partner speaks one language and you speak another, there's not an automatic guarantee that your children are going to grow up bilingual. You do have to put in a little bit of effort, a little bit of forethought, and a little bit of planning, because it is something that's very important for your kids. Method number 2, minority language at home. So again, by minority language, we're referring to the language that is less common in the area where you live. So if you live, for example, in the United States, but you want your kids to speak Spanish, then if you're using the minority language at home method, you're going to exclusively speak Spanish to them at home. Now, the minority language at home method obviously works best when everyone at home can at least understand the minority language well. But if, for example, you as the mother speak Spanish, your husband doesn't speak much Spanish, this is not going to be the ideal method for you, because ideally everyone would be able to communicate in this language at home and allowed to speak the other language outside of the home. So this is what differentiates this one from the one parent, one language method, in which each one chooses a language to speak to the child. Minority language at home will work best when everyone can understand the minority language, but your kids just need that opportunity and that environment to practice that minority language. Method number 3, time and place. So this method involves setting a certain time or place to speak one language or the other. For example, a family could say that before 2 p.m. we speak English, after 2 p.m. we all speak French. Or another family could say we can speak English most of the day, but at meal times together we're only going to speak Spanish at the table. This can be an interesting method, although the concerns with this method is that it can leave one language with much more exposure than the other, depending on how you're doing it, and it's a bit harder to remember than the other methods outlined above. Still, it can work. And if you're a family who is all learning the language together, it can be really fun to put this into practice. For example, we're an English-speaking family, but at the table we speak Spanish. I can see the potential for that to be really fun, with everyone trying to express themselves and having to only speak Spanish. It's going to be great speaking practice. That challenge is going to be really good for everyone involved. Method number 4, language immersion classes. Language immersion classes, if you have that opportunity, are wonderful for your children. So in this way, they're not taking a specific, for example, Spanish class, rather their regular curriculum is being taught in both languages. If you have that program available where you live, it could be an excellent option to check out, or if not, or if you homeschool your children like I do, you can choose a bilingual homeschool program. I did a detailed video in which I talked about Mati homeschool, and that is the program that we are using for our oldest daughter. It's been really nice to help her read both languages and just get all of her subjects in both languages. So this is one of the best ways in which a monolingual family can really create a decent amount of exposure to the minority language for their children. And unlike traditional language classes where your kid is in English all day, for example, and then they have one Spanish class and then kind of move on with their life, with language immersion classes where the regular subjects are being taught in both languages, this is beneficial not only because obviously the child has more exposure to the minority language, but also because they start to see the language as a language of communication and not just another subject at school. Method number 5, move abroad, or at least travel. So this is the most radical on the list, and of course not everyone can just up and move abroad, especially not with the sole purpose of language learning. However, speaking from experience, a move abroad can be one of the richest experiences that a child or an adult can have. Nowadays, there are so many families realizing that they can possibly provide a better quality of life for their children overseas. Oftentimes, when we're talking about countries such as the US, Canada, the UK, countries that are more expensive to live in, Many times, a move abroad will result in a drastically reduced cost of living and oftentimes more opportunities. Now, it doesn't have to be a permanent move. A temporary relocation can provide a perfect opportunity for both language immersion and beautiful new cultural experiences. Some parents have their children attend local schools to accelerate the process of language acquisition, and even those who homeschool their children can still find an endless source of socialization opportunities. So this is a wonderful option both for children and parents to learn a new language. The last 5 items on our list apply to everyone, regardless of your circumstances, things that you can do at home, no matter how many languages are usually spoken in your home and by whom. These are just simple things that you can do at home. So number 6, as we touched on in our last video as well, is to get interested in a new language yourself and have your kids follow whatever program you're following. Depending on their ages, you may have to modify it a bit. But sometimes I'm surprised when my 7-year-old comes and she joins me in Pimsleur French and Rocket French. So things that are not actually geared towards children, sometimes we tend to shy away from those things and think that they have to have lots of puppets and cartoons in their face in the target language in order to learn, but it's not always the case. She doesn't spend half an hour or an hour like I do studying. However, she will spend a little bit of time with me, and so it's really been fun to have brief French conversations with her because she picks things up really fast. So give them an option to follow along with the book that you're studying or the language learning program that you're using. You may be surprised. They may be quite interested. If you, parent, are interested in learning Spanish, then grab a free copy of my Spanish Fluency Blueprint. It's going to take you step by step through a very powerful and effective study method that I've created and that I use myself to learn languages. You can find that at ericaelsewhere.com/blueprint, and I'll link to that below as well. Number 7, read to your children regularly in both languages. Reading to your kids anyway is something so important to do, and why not do it in 2 languages? Obviously, if you already speak another language, this is going to be easier, but it's still something that you may need to be reminded to do because you may be so focused on perhaps the language of where you live that you forget about the need to obtain resources, books in your native tongue and speak and teach it to your children. Now, if you are learning a new language along with your children, some languages obviously are going to be easier to learn to read than others. For example, Spanish is a very easy language to learn to read, to learn to pronounce. It is so easy these days to find audiobooks, children's audiobooks, or audiobooks for adults. Like if you have teenagers, they're probably going to be more interested in higher level books. But for the shorter children's books, it's really easy to just look that up on YouTube, and very often you'll find someone reading the book. So that can help you know how to pronounce it and how to read it to your children. Teach them how to read the language also so that they can read books for themselves. Here are a few from our collection in Spanish. And in my case, I don't know if it's gonna focus, but I'm just gonna hold these up as I continue to talk. Never mind the bite marks. Yeah, sometimes I'll want to eat the book rather than read it, but it's all good. So in my case, obviously it's very easy to find Spanish books where I live, but I have to get them English books as well. So I will order them often from Amazon. Amazon is our friend. We have some books that are bilingual, like this, Jorge el Curioso, Curious George. Each page actually has English and Spanish. Yeah. And just get simple books. Even if your kids are a little older, get simple books to start out with if you're just learning the language or if they are just learning the language. I really enjoy reading children's books in French right now because they're easier to read. And don't worry so much about pronunciation. If you think, well, I don't feel like I'm pronouncing everything properly, so I'm going to transmit that bad pronunciation to my kids. So obviously, always be working on your pronunciation, but don't ever let that hold you back. One, because kids have a tendency, as long as they're exposed to other speakers speaking the language, they have a tendency, I believe, I've seen in my experience, to eventually kind of gravitate towards the correct pronunciation. For example, my daughter, when she was in school before we started homeschooling, she had English class with a non-native English speaking teacher. When she was 3 years old, when she was in preschool, sometimes she would come home speaking English with a Mexican accent, which was hilarious, honestly. But she would even hear herself doing that and correct herself. Of course, she had already been exposed to English through me. But think, for example, of immigrant families who often the parents do speak English with a stronger accent than their kids, even though they all started learning at the same time when they arrived to the United States. So kids have a tendency to pick up the more native pronunciation, and even if not, it is far better for your kids to have exposure to the language, to learn how to speak the language even with an accent. Would you rather your child not speak any other language or for them to speak it with an accent? I mean, come on, it's okay. So tip number 8, find other fun resources to use with your kids. For example, I came across this really cool resource called Foreign Languages for Kids by Kids. I'll link to that below. I believe that they only have Spanish available at this time, but basically it's kids in everyday situations doing these little skits completely in the target language. So it's really cute. I will link to that below. You can also pay for private lessons for your children, whether that be in person or online. I used to teach English to Chinese students online, and it was a lot of fun. It was exhausting because of the high energy level that we had to maintain. But, you know, between the singing and the puppets and all of that, the children are usually very engaged and did really well. So that's a nice option as well to look into. And for example, with italki, which is one of the websites that I most recommend to find tutors to practice the language with, you can actually narrow down your tutors specifically to those who are experienced working with children. So that could be a nice affordable option as well. Method number 9, use songs, use music. Music was my very first exposure to Spanish way back when, and that had a really powerful effect on me. Music also has a way of helping you to retain words and phrases, even when you don't know what they mean. I used to listen to Spanish songs because my dad would listen to Spanish songs. I had no idea what they were saying, but I learned to sing along, and I think that that probably had an effect on my ability to retain certain vocabulary words because they were familiar to me. So definitely encourage your children to listen to music in another language that they enjoy. That will also help them to develop positive vibes and a positive attitude towards this different language and culture. And it really may make them more interested to get to learn the language. So the final thing on my list that you can do, number 10, would be to include cultural studies in your teachings. So don't just teach them the language, teach them a bit about the culture that the language comes from. For example, if your child is having trouble accepting the need to learn the minority language, like if you are having trouble getting them to speak your native tongue and they only want to speak English, for example, or whatever other majority language of where you live, then teaching your child about the people and the places and the history of that language can go a long way in aiding their understanding that this is something important to learn. It can be hard for a child to connect with a language when he doesn't hear anyone else speaking it except his parents or except one parent. Use books, videos, and other tools so that the child understands that this is a real language. Real people speak it in different parts of the world, and knowing that language will open up more possibilities for him or her in the future. Again, ultimately, if you can travel to the place where they speak that language, it's going to be an amazing, impactful experience in your child's life. And just 3 quick bonus tips for you parents regarding your personal development. 1, educate yourself about what to expect from bilingual children at different stages of their development. 2, never scold your child if they speak the wrong language at the wrong time or with the wrong parent. Really, no such thing exists. At the end of the day, if they're communicating, they're doing what they're supposed to do, you can gently remind them of the importance of following the family plan so that we get really good at speaking both of these languages, but always encourage positive feelings towards learning a new language, because ultimately negative feelings or feeling pressured is going to have the opposite effect of what you want. And 3, don't ever give up. The journey is not always easy, but the benefits of raising bilingual children far outweigh any obstacle that you may come across. Many children who were resistant to learning their parents' native language grow up to either be grateful that they did or sorry that they didn't. There's really no in between. So be patient, but do be consistent. Your children will thank you later. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss our next video all about language learning. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you soon. Hasta la próxima. Ciao.